There's something rather amusing happening in our time that everywhere you turn, someone is telling you to think positive. Change your thoughts, they say. Replace the negative with the positive, as if your mind were a broken radio that simply needs retuning. And millions of people are trying desperately to do exactly that. They're fighting their own thoughts, wrestling with their own minds, exhausting themselves in a battle they cannot possibly win. Because here's what nobody tells you. The moment you try to control a thought, you've already lost. Let me ask you something. Have you ever tried not to think about something? Really tried? Someone says, don't think about a pink elephant. And what happens? There it is, a pink elephant, prancing through your consciousness, as if it owns the place. The harder you push it away, the more vividly it appears. This is not a failure on your part. This is simply how consciousness works. Resistance creates persistence. The very act of fighting a thought gives it energy, substance, reality. But we've built an entire industry around this futile struggle. Positive thinking, affirmations, thought replacement techniques, all of it based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what thoughts actually are. We treat thoughts as if they were things we possess, things we can control, things we can arrange like furniture in a room. But thoughts are not possessions. They're more like weather. They arise, they pass, they change, completely independent of what you want or don't want. Think about it. You decide what to think next. And these thoughts simply appear in consciousness. There's one moment you're thinking about your grocery list. The next moment you're remembering something someone said to you 15 years ago. Did you choose that? Did you sit down and decide, now I shall think about that embarrassing moment from high school? Of course not. Thoughts arise on their own, like bubbles rising in water. And yet we've convinced ourselves that we should be able to control this process, that a good person, the spiritually evolved person, the mentally healthy person should be able to think only positive thoughts, should be able to eliminate negativity, banish fear, delete anger, as if consciousness were a computer program, and you could simply delete the files you don't want. But here's what happens when you try. Let's say you have a thought that frightens you. Maybe you think, I might fail at this important thing I'm attempting. Immediately, the positive thinking police in your head sound the alarm. No, you must not think that. You must replace it with a positive thought. So you try, you say to yourself, I will succeed, I am confident, I believe in myself. But notice what's happened. You haven't eliminated the first thought. You've simply added a second thought on top of it. The original fear is still there, but now it's covered with a layer of forced positivity. It's like painting over rust. It might look better on the surface, but underneath, the corrosion continues. In fact, it often gets worse because now you've added something else, the thought that you shouldn't be having the first thought. Now you're afraid of your fear. You're anxious about your anxiety. You're negative about your negativity. This creates what I call the double bind of thought control. You have the original unwanted thought, and then you have the thought that you shouldn't be having the original thought, and then you have the thought that you're failing because you still have the original thought, and so on, until you're trapped in an endless spiral of thoughts about thoughts, about thoughts. And all the while you're exhausted, frustrated, convinced that something is wrong with you because you can't seem to master your own mind. I once knew a woman who had intrusive thoughts that terrified her. Random violent images would flash through her mind. She was convinced this meant she was a terrible person, that something was deeply wrong with her psychology. So she tried everything to stop these thoughts: meditation, therapy, affirmations, medication. And the more she fought, the more frequent and vivid the thoughts became. She was at war with her own consciousness. And like all wars, it was creating nothing but suffering. Then one day, something shifted. She stopped fighting, not because she found some technique or strategy, but simply because she was too tired to continue the battle. And in that exhaustion, that surrender, she noticed something interesting. The thoughts were still there, but they were just thoughts. They arose, they passed, and they had no more reality than a cloud passing through the sky. She wasn't the thoughts, she was the space in which thoughts appeared. This is the great paradox. The moment you stop trying to change your thoughts, they lose their power over you. Not because they disappear, but because you realize they were never the problem. The problem was your relationship to them. The problem was the belief that you had to do something about them. You see, consciousness is not something you do. It's something you are. And thoughts are simply movements in consciousness, like waves on the ocean. The ocean doesn't try to control the waves. It doesn't judge some waves as good and others as bad. It simply allows them to rise and fall according to their nature. And you are not the waves of thought. You are the ocean itself. You are the vast awareness in which thoughts appear and disappear. But we've forgotten this. We've identified so completely with our thoughts that we think we are them. When a fearful thought arises, we say, I am afraid. When an angry thought arises, we say, I am angry. That this is like the ocean saying, I am this particular wave. It's a case of mistaken identity. The wave is something happening in the ocean, not something the ocean is. Let me give you another image. Imagine you're sitting in a movie theater watching a film. On the screen, terrible things are happening. Violence, tragedy, horror. Now, if you're completely absorbed in the movie, if you've forgotten you're in a theater, you might become genuinely distressed. Your heart might race, you might feel fear or sadness. But the moment you remember, oh, this is just a movie, these are just images on a screen, everything changes. The images are still the same, the story hasn't changed, but your relationship to it has transformed completely. Thoughts are like this. They're images playing on the screen of consciousness. When you are identified with them, when you think they're reality, they can cause tremendous suffering. But when you remember that they're just thoughts, just movements in awareness, they lose their power to disturb you. You can watch the scariest thought movie without being frightened because you know it's just a movie. Now, I'm not saying thoughts don't matter. Obviously, thoughts influence behavior, and behavior has consequences. If you think, I should punch that person, and then you act on that thought, well, consequences will follow. But here's the subtle point. You don't have to act on every thought that arises. In fact, most thoughts are not calls to action. They're simply mental weather passing through. The person who understands this can watch all sorts of thoughts arise without being compelled to do anything about them. A thought of anger can arise, and they can observe it with curiosity rather than immediately expressing it or suppressing it. A thought of fear can arise, and they can notice it without either running away or forcing themselves to be brave. They've learned what you might call the art of mental aikido. Instead of meeting thoughts with resistance, they allow thoughts to pass through without engagement. This is very different from suppression. Suppression is pushing thoughts down, trying to bury them. But thoughts that are suppressed don't disappear. They go underground, like water behind a dam, building up pressure until eventually they burst through, often with greater force than before. No, what I'm describing is not suppression. It's observation without judgment, without the need to change what you're observing. Think of it like this. You're standing by a river and you see a log floating by. You don't jump into the river and try to push the log upstream. You don't stand there cursing the log for floating. You simply watch it pass. It comes into view. It moves through your field of vision, disappears downstream. Your relationship to thoughts can be exactly like this. They arise in consciousness. They move through awareness. They dissolve back into the vast space from which they came. But our culture has taught us to do the opposite. We've been taught that we must manage our thoughts, curate them, keep only the good ones and eliminate the bad ones. This creates an impossible situation because the very attempt to eliminate certain thoughts makes them more prominent. It's like trying to smooth water by hitting it. Every blow creates more ripples. I remember sitting with a friend who was deeply anxious about an upcoming event. He kept saying, I need to stop being so anxious. I need to think positive thoughts. I need to calm down And with each, his anxiety visibly increased. Finally, I said to him, what if you didn't need to stop being anxious? What if the anxiety could just be here, like a guest in your house? You don't have to like it, you don't have to make it tea, but you also don't have to fight it or throw it out. He looked at me as if I'd suggested something impossible. But then, just for a moment, he stopped fighting. He stopped trying to change what he was feeling. And in that moment, something relaxed. The anxiety was still there, but it was no longer amplified by the resistance to it. It was just anxiety, a sensation in the body, a pattern of thoughts, unpleasant perhaps, but no longer overwhelming. This is what happens when you stop trying to control your thoughts. They don't necessarily become more positive. You don't suddenly start thinking only beautiful, uplifting thoughts, but they lose their grip on you. You see them for what they are. Temporary movements in consciousness, no more solid or permanent than a breeze. And here's something else that happens. When you stop resisting your thoughts, when you stop trying to change them, you begin to notice patterns. You see how certain thoughts trigger other thoughts. You see how a thought of inadequacy might lead to a thought of comparison, which leads to a thought of resentment, which leads to a thought of shame. It's like watching dominoes fall, one thought triggering the next in a predictable cascade. But when you're fighting your thoughts, you can't see these patterns. You're too busy wrestling with each individual thought as it arises. It's only in the space of non-resistance that you can step back and observe the whole process. And in that observation, something remarkable happens. The patterns begin to lose their automatic quality. They still arise, but you're no longer compelled to follow them to their conclusion. A thought of inadequacy arises, and instead of automatically falling into the familiar spiral, you simply notice, there's that thought again. And somehow in that simple noticing, the thought loses its momentum. It's like watching a wave that never quite forms. It rises a little, then dissolves back into the ocean. This is the freedom that comes not from controlling thoughts, but from understanding your relationship to them. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness in which thoughts appear. This is not just a nice philosophical idea. It's something you can verify directly in your own experience right now. Notice that you can observe your thoughts. Right now, as you're taking in these words, you can notice thoughts arising. This makes sense, or this is confusing, or I should remember this, or whatever thoughts are appearing. And if you can observe thoughts, then you must be something other than thoughts. The eye cannot see itself. The finger cannot touch itself. Awareness cannot be aware of itself as an object, but it can be aware of thoughts. Therefore, you are awareness, not thought. This is not complicated. In fact, it's so simple that we tend to miss it. We're looking for some great revelation, some profound experience, when all that's needed is to notice what's already obvious. You are the space in which experience happens. Thoughts happen in you, not to you. They arise in awareness, move through awareness, dissolve back into awareness. And awareness itself remains unchanged, like the ocean remaining the ocean, no matter what waves rise and fall on its surface. When this is seen, really seen, not just understood intellectually, but directly perceived, everything changes. You're still going to have thoughts, pleasant thoughts, unpleasant thoughts, wise thoughts, foolish thoughts. The weather of the mind continues, but you're no longer at the mercy of that weather. You're like someone standing on a mountaintop, watching storm clouds gather and disperse in the valley below. The storms happen, but up here, in the space of pure awareness, there is peace. Now you might ask, but what about genuinely destructive thought patterns? What about depression, anxiety, trauma? And this is an important question. I'm not suggesting that serious psychological difficulties don't require professional help, therapy, sometimes medication. What I am saying is that the fundamental stance toward thoughts, even difficult thoughts, can shift from resistance to observation. And this shift itself can be deeply healing. Even in the midst of clinical depression, there can be a recognition that the depressive thoughts, however convincing they seem, are still just thoughts. They arise in awareness, and awareness itself is not depressed. There's a space around the thoughts a space that's always available, even in the darkest moments. This doesn't cure depression, but it can provide what you might call breathing room, a little space between you and the thoughts, just enough space to prevent complete identification with them. The same is true for anxiety, for anger, for any mental state. The state itself might remain, but your relationship to it can transform. You're no longer the person who is anxious. Your awareness, and anxiety is something happening in awareness. This is not a semantic game. It's a fundamental shift in perspective that changes everything. And paradoxically, when you stop trying to change your mental states, they often begin to change on their own. Not because you're doing anything to them, but because resistance was what was keeping them locked in place. It's like clenching your fist around sand. The tighter you hold, the more it slips through your fingers. But open your hand, and the sand rests gently in your palm. Here's something fascinating about this process. When you begin to observe thoughts without trying to control them, you start to notice something about their nature. Thoughts are not continuous. They're discrete. There are gaps between thoughts, tiny spaces of pure awareness. Most people never notice these gaps because they're too busy being swept along by the stream of thinking. But when you're no longer fighting thoughts, when you're simply watching them, these gaps become obvious. And in these gaps, something extraordinary reveals itself. The kind of silence that is not empty but full, a peace that has no opposite. These moments between thoughts are like windows into your true nature. They're glimpses of the awareness that you fundamentally are, unclouded by mental activity. And the more you notice these gaps, the more they seem to expand. Not because you're doing anything to make them expand, but because you're paying attention to them. It's similar to what happens when you sit quietly in nature. At first, you might think it's silent, but as you settle, you begin to hear sounds you didn't notice before. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the movement of air. The silence was never really silent. It was full of subtle sounds that your busy mind had filtered out. In the same way, the gaps between thoughts are not empty, nothingness. They're the background hum of pure consciousness, always present but usually overlooked. This is why ancient meditation practices often emphasize simply watching the breath or observing thoughts without judgment. It's not that these practices create some special state. They simply help you notice what was always there. The spacious awareness that contains all experience, the silence between the notes that makes the music possible. But notice something important here. I'm not telling you to achieve this state. I'm not giving you a new technique to master. That would just be another form of the same old struggle. Another way of trying to control your experience. What I'm pointing to is something you're already doing. Right now, as you read these words, you're aware that awareness doesn't need to be created or improved or perfected. It's already complete, already whole, already free. The only question is whether you recognize it. And even that's not really a question, because the recognition is also happening in awareness. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to get to. You're already home. You've always been home. You just forgot to notice. Children understand this naturally. Watch a child at play. One moment they're crying because they've fallen and scraped their knee. The next moment, a butterfly catches their attention and they're completely absorbed in wonder. The thought, my knee hurts, is replaced by look at the butterfly, and the pain, while still present, no longer dominates their experience. They haven't suppressed the pain. They haven't used positive thinking to overcome it. They've simply allowed their attention to move naturally, like water finding its course. We adults have lost this fluidity. We grip our thoughts like precious possessions or dangerous enemies. We think we need to manage them, organize them, control them. But thoughts are like water. The more you try to grasp them, the more they slip away. The more you relax your grip, the more freely they flow. So what am I really saying here? I'm saying that the positive thinking industry has sold us a beautiful lie. The lie is that you can and should control your thoughts, that you can curate your consciousness like a garden, keeping only the flowers and removing all the weeds. But consciousness is not a garden. It's a wilderness. And in that wilderness, all kinds of life forms appear and disappear. Some beautiful, some ugly, some neutral, Your job is not to manage this wilderness. Your job is simply to be the space in which it all happens. This is what I call the art of letting thoughts pass, not controlling them, not changing them, not even particularly believing them, just watching them arise and dissolve like clouds in an empty sky. And in that watching, in that allowing, you discover something extraordinary. You discover that you are not the prisoner of your own mind. You are the vast freedom in which all mental prisons appear and disappear. The thoughts come, and you let them come. The thoughts go, and you let them go. And meanwhile, you remain unchanging awareness, the eternal witness, the space that was never born and can never die. This is who you really are. Not the voice in your head, but the silence in which the voice speaks. Not the waves, but the ocean itself. And once you see this, really see it, the whole game changes. You're still going to have thoughts, probably thousands of them every day, but they no longer have the power to define you, to limit you, to imprison you. They're just weather. And you are the sky, vast, open, free, always have been, always will be. Stop fighting your thoughts. Let them pass and discover the peace that was always there, waiting quietly beneath the noise.